crisis, and there seems to be no escape. And it hasn't just gone on for a day or for a week or for a year, but it's gone on for 10 years. It's gone on for 20 years. And your suffering just does not make sense. It's in this moment that we have to understand what Jesus really came to do with suffering. Jesus didn't come to take away suffering. And that's hard because we think like, wait, why wouldn't he? Doesn't he love us? Why wouldn't Jesus come to take away suffering? No, he didn't do that. In fact, he said this. He says, in this world you'll have trouble, but take heart. Like, take courage. I have overcome the world. In this world you will have suffering, but take heart. I have overcome this world. Basically, Jesus didn't come to take away suffering. He came to transform suffering. Now, our suffering might not make sense, but Jesus Christ gives your suffering and my suffering meaning. In fact, this is what even St. Paul says in the 1 Corinthians chapter 1 and 2. He says that Jesus on the cross seems like foolishness, and it seems like powerlessness. It's a stumbling block to Jews, and it's foolishness to Gentiles. That it does. It seems, again, it's foolishness and it's weakness, and that's ridiculous. But we look at Jesus on the cross and we realize actually what St. Paul says is, but Jesus on the cross, he's actually the power of God. What looks like complete weakness, that's the power of God and the wisdom of God. What looks like foolishness is actually the wisdom of God. What is he saying? He's saying this, that might not make sense. Jesus on the cross makes no sense, but that's how God redeemed the world. By taking on a body and suffering in and through that body, Jesus doesn't take away suffering, he transforms suffering, and he makes it, the big word, he makes it redemptive. In fact, that's how God redeemed the world, is he entered into the depths of our experience. He entered into the emptiness that we feel. He entered into what feels like abandonment. He enters into betrayal. He enters into absolute loneliness. He enters into a tomb. Jesus descended to hell. There is no depth that Christ hasn't gone. There's no amount of suffering that he didn't endure, not to take it away, but to redeem it, to transform it. And now as a Christian, he invites you into it. Again, he doesn't invite you out of suffering. He invites you into it. Not just into more suffering, like you need to punish yourself, you need to beat yourself up. He invites you into the redemptive part of suffering. In Colossians chapter 1, verse 24, St. Paul says this. He says, I rejoice in my sufferings. We think that's ridiculous. Why would you rejoice in your sufferings? Well, because he was a glutton for punishment. No, St. Paul is able to say, no, I rejoice in my sufferings for your sake. And in my flesh, I am making up for what is lacking in the sufferings of Jesus for the sake of his body, the church. Now, at one point you say, wait, in your body, you're making up for what is lacking in the sufferings of Jesus? What's lacking in the sufferings of Jesus? John Paul II asked this question a number of years ago. The answer is nothing. That Jesus' sacrifice is complete. It's whole, it's entire. There's nothing more to be offered. Then how can St. Paul say, I'm making up in my body what's lacking in the sufferings of Christ? John Paul went on to explain. He said, the sacrifice of Jesus is complete. It's full. There's no more offering for sin. But he says, but so that you and I can participate in his redemptive work of the world, Jesus extends to us a sliver of his cross. When we experience any kind of suffering, whether that's just super small or something that's overwhelming, Jesus has extended to us a particle of his cross, a sliver of his cross, so that we can become co-workers with him, that we could actually be co-redeemers with Jesus. Not because he needs it, but because he's extending that dignity to us. He's extending that grace to us. He's extending the opportunity to us that when you feel you're most weak, when you feel absolutely powerless, when you feel completely foolish, there's nothing left to give, that even in that moment, Jesus Christ can make you strong. Not because he takes away the suffering, but because he transforms it. And this is the secret of basically every single saint. This Lent, the suffering you and I experience, it might be unasked for. It might be something we didn't seek out, but also could be something we gave up this, we gave up that. Suffering without Jesus just hurts, and all of us are going to suffer. But suffering united to Jesus, suffering with Jesus, having our particle, our sliver of the cross, and knowing that means we're close to Jesus on the cross, suffering with Jesus can change the world. This Lent or this life, you may be in the midst of suffering. My invitation, and I know it's hard, I know it's difficult, my invitation to you is to bring it to the Lord on the cross and say, Lord, for you, let me offer this suffering for you. Let me offer this suffering with you. In suffering with you, let this weakness now have power. Let this thing that seems like it doesn't make sense, let it have meaning. And let that meaning be, the world is redeemed by my joining my suffering to yours, Lord. From all of us here at Ascension Presents, my name is Father Mike. God bless.
Well, what wisdom have you been able to find from God about why there is suffering in the world, why there's cruelty?
You know, there's a saying that I wanted to ask God about why he allows hunger and war and poverty, but I was afraid he might ask me the same question. God has certainly given us enough food. There's enough food in the world for everyone to have a 3,200 calorie diet a day. God has certainly given us enough guidance for us to not inflict on each other the cruelty that we inflict. When we look to the world around us, first and foremost, we have to have a sense of accountability. We are accountable for our own actions. We don't blame God for the evil of man. That's one. But at the same time, we understand that God in his wisdom allows for certain outcomes that we cannot encompass with our own. And that to isolate these incidents and to try to make sense of them is no different than a baby in the womb that doesn't understand the world that it's coming into and trying to explain to that baby that hasn't yet developed its own senses and its own perception of this world what is happening to it, right? You know, I often think of the example of a child and, you know, having been at this point now through the experience of parenthood, I'm still learning. I'm just going into having a teenager, but 3 kids and being a softie for my kids, you know, when you have to tell your child that they can't have something that they really, really want. And that child thinks you hate them at some point, you know, because why are you stopping me from putting this toy in my mouth and choking myself? They don't get it, right? But at the same time, you prevent them out of love. They're not in a position to understand that you're preventing them out of love. And to isolate these incidents with God and to say, the wisdom, what's the wisdom? You're trying to make sense of a pixel when you can't see the bigger picture. Your mind is not at a place where you can make sense of the bigger picture. You haven't seen the bigger picture. And so for him to even explain to us every incident would completely defeat the purpose of putting your trust in him. So we believe in a God that is all-encompassing in his knowledge and wisdom, that give, by the way, that there is what God tells us to do, and there's what God allows to happen. So what God tells us to do in terms of the roadmap towards good, and then what God allows to happen in his divine wisdom, that no outcome can escape him, but at the same time, we are accountable for our own actions and our own deeds. So when you come to someone and say, you know, why did God allow this to happen to this person? I can't rationalize that for you because my understanding is relegated to the immediate experience in front of me. But if I know God and if I learn about God, then I don't have to make sense of the plan, but I can tell you that I trust the planner. And I think that that's where peace is found. You know, a lot of times you look for the light at the end of the tunnel. What's the light at the end of the tunnel? There's emphasis on God and the hereafter, because to try to make sense of divine decree and why certain things happen in this world without the existence of a God or without the existence of a hereafter will always fail you. So the existence of a God that is all-knowing what we don't know. I know what you don't know, that understands what we don't understand. The existence of a God who is not subject to our constrictions, and the existence of a hereafter where all things find recourse, where there is divine recourse, allows for this world to be situated within the existence of something greater and not treated in isolation. So when you're trying to treat an incident of this world in isolation, you're going to fail. And when you try to treat existence in this world and of this world in isolation, you're also going to fail. And so the emphasis is the belief in God, a God that is not limited like you are, and a belief in the hereafter that is not limited like this life. And so everything continues onwards, and there's divine recourse for everything, each and everything. This is perhaps referring to the prophet Job, Ayub, peace be upon him, because Job lived obviously a life of great difficulty, but that a person who lived a very hard life would be dipped into paradise one time, and just with a dip be asked, have you ever seen any hardship? Have you ever seen any misery? And that person would say, what is sadness? What is hardship? What is misery? Now, if you don't believe in the hereafter, if you don't believe in anything beyond this life, then the recourse has to happen in this life. And because we see so many people pass through this life without recourse of cruelty, without recourse of suffering, then we're forced to try to make sense of it. And if you are someone who believes that this entire world came into existence through randomness, that we're just an existence of random atoms that collide with each other and that all of this comes together out of nothing, then how can you put your trust in anything that is greater? So you asked me as a child of a parent who suffered, I believe that every moment that my mother suffered, that she will be rewarded, that she will be elevated, that all of that made her or contributed to the beautiful person that she was, and will contribute to the beautiful reward that she receives. And the recourse is certain to me as a believer in that.
So the right approach to making sense of the world, especially making sense of suffering and cruelty, is that of humility, that we as humans cannot possibly understand.